Hi, friends. This is Adam Shoemaker, Rector at St. Stephen's Episcopal Church in downtown Charleston. And I'm here for a special edition of my Rector's Corner interviews. I'm here with the Reverend Dr. Stuart Hoke, who served on staff at Trinity Church, Wall Street in New York City in Lower Manhattan, adjacent to the former Twin Towers, and was serving there on September 11th, 2001. And as we approach the 20th anniversary of that very dark day, Stuart is here to share his reflections. And Stuart, thank you very much for being with me today. I wonder if you could begin by simply describing your personal experience on that day. Where were you and how did you make it through the day?
I'm very happy to be here. Thank you. I love your church. I wish I could be your curate sometimes. I lived on the Upper West Side of Manhattan at that time in history, and I usually celebrated the Eucharist on Tuesday mornings at St. Michael's Church, 99th in Amsterdam. After I finished, which was about 8 o'clock, I went to the subway at 96th and Broadway, took the express train all the way down to Chambers Street, got off the express train, got on the local, and got out at Rector. That particular day, it was a very beautiful fall-like day. It was a Carolina blue in the sky, a chill in the air, and I had a coat on, which figured prominently in the hours to come, a jacket, sport jacket. Got to Chambers Street, and the conductor on the train said, "Get out of the train." And then he yelled, "Get out of the train." And then he said, "Get back on the train." And he did it loudly. I was one of the few that got back on the train. And what had happened was that first plane had crashed into the South Tower of the World Trade Center. The conductor didn't know much about it. He simply, as he was said in an article the next day in the Times, he sped through the next stop and he got to Rector Street, and I got out of the train. The sky had turned from a bright blue to a dark gray. There was debris in the sky. Someone from the real estate department of Trinity Church, Trinity Church has 46 departments, one of which is the church itself. And the other at that time was the largest real estate operation in the city, of commercial real estate in the city. So man from real estate said, "Stuart, there's a small plane that hit the South Tower." And we ran down the street to see what was going on. We were standing at the entrance of the Sam Goody Music Company, the North Tower entrance, watching the South Tower burn. About 2 minutes to 9, that Boeing 767 from the west crashed into the tower 1,000 feet above us. Debris fell. The street was ignited with fire from the jet fuel. A holocaust in the sky, an ear-splitting noise, and the woman next to me saying, "Is this a setting for a movie?" And a lot of people must have been in that state because nobody moved. They just stood there and looked. I later read a definition of denial that says denial is refusing to acknowledge what in my heart I know to be true. Denial is sincerely believing that which is not true. And we stood there waiting for Bruce Willis, I guess. At that moment, I ran into my office building. Trinity had a 25-story office building at the time. The rector directed me to the church. He said, "People are streaming down Broadway looking for safety, and they're going into the church. They're not looking for worship. They're going into the church looking for sanctuary, solace, silence." And he said, "Go over there and do something." Organist was standing by, and he said to the organist, "You go also." And we both said, "What would you have us do?" And the rector said, "I don't know, just go over there and do something." So we ran over there, and like Anglicans, we put on our vestments as we went into the situation. We put on black cassocks and our surplice. He went to the organ bench. I went to the chancel crossing. And there began an extemporaneous service of reading scripture, singing hymns, and saying the prayers of the church. And there I stood doing that until that second building fell, and clear-story windows began to fall out, lights went out, and all hell broke loose. And at that moment, I went back to the office building. I'd like to say something about what went on in that service because it was seminal to the events of the day. One of the biggest spiritual awakenings that I had, simultaneous with some of the most turmoil that I've ever experienced within my soul, body, and spirit on any occasion. And that's lasted for 20 years, especially at this time of year. I began by reading the prayers of the church, one of which was, O God of peace, who has taught us that in returning and rest, we shall be safe. Quietness and confidence shall be our strength. Lift us, we pray you, to your presence, where we can be still and know that you are God, that you are closer to us than the breath we breathe, and always doing for us far better things than we can ever ask or imagine. And after I said that prayer, which is the prayer for quiet confidence in the prayer book, I know a lot of those prayers by memory, thank heavens, because I couldn't find them at the time. First time in my life, I've been a priest for 49 years. It's never happened before or after. A man stood up and he said, "Do it again." And I did the prayer again. And I thought he must have been an angel because those had key words in there. Lift us to your presence where we can be still in this moment and know that you're working in our lives. And indeed, we saw that happen all through the day. I mean, if God had a job description, it would be the God of redemption. God is always bringing good out of evil, life out of death, light out of darkness, joy out of suffering. It's called redemption. Sometimes it happens in long periods, and sometimes it happens nanoseconds after the event itself. That man standing up was the first occasion for a good sight, a good sighting of redemption itself. We sang hymns. The people were as frightened as you can imagine. They were people of all sorts and conditions. They were not Episcopalians looking for worship. They were people looking for shelter. And I was there to provide some kind of spiritual comfort and also crowd control, because we didn't know what was going on. So I would periodically say, ladies and gentlemen, let us observe silence and be quiet and know that God is with us. In moments to come, the sky continued to darken. The sirens rang outside. Occasionally, we heard people yelling and screaming as they were running down Broadway. And I sang a hymn, or I had them sing a hymn with me, that a kind of a minor spiritual awakening occurred for all of us. I made a huge musical faux pas. I said, the next hymn will be Nearer My God to Thee. And this man jumped up out of the pew and said, no, not that one. And it dawned on me, because I'm old enough to remember the first rendition of the movie Titanic, where as the little boat was sinking, the brass band on the ship was playing Nearer My God to Thee. So I switched to O God, our help in ages past. Now get this, the sky was dark. We heard horrible noises outside, especially people screaming as they ran down the street. The air conditioner vent at Trinity Church had begun to suck in some of the debris, so it was raining from the ceiling. And we were singing, O God, our help in ages past, our hope for years to come, our shelter from the stormy blast, and our eternal home. When we sang our shelter from the stormy blast, the entire congregation made that incredible noise that usually comes out as aha when you have a spiritual awakening. That day it was massive. They went, oh, like that, as if the juxtaposition of what was going on the outside and what we were experiencing on the inside was remarkable. That was a huge spiritual awakening. Again, one of those signs of redemption that happens at a time like that. Well, I continued. We read the 23rd Psalm maybe 3 times. 27th Psalm. I read the Beatitudes. Thank God I know scripture and I know hymnody and I know the prayers in the book, so I could flip back and forth and be able to do that. My legs shook the entire event, but I had my brains with me, at least at that moment. I don't have them as much today, but I did then. And we came across another event. It was the reading of St. Paul's epistle to the Romans. We always read it at Episcopal burial services. And it was, there is nothing in all creation that could ever separate us from the love of God. Neither life, nor death, nor angel, nor principality, and it goes on. I think the greatest fear at that moment was the fear of alienation, disconnection, separation, because we knew that death was imminent. And here I said, at least to myself and maybe to others, nothing can separate us from God's love, neither life, especially death. I had read those words 1,000 times, I think. I had never seen the word death. I was preparing for my own death. The sky was falling. The floor was being pulled out from under us. And all of a sudden, it was a wave of assurance. It was not reassurance. Reassurance wouldn't cut anything. I mean, it was a word from the Word, which said to me, this is God speaking, hear it. So I sort of lived on that for the next several days. We came to a point in that little spontaneous service where there were a lot of people, and indeed the sky did fall. The second tower, the North Tower, began to fall. A woman on the front row of the church who happened to be a member of the vestry, she was someone like E.F. Hutton, if you remember that commercial from years ago. When E.F. Hutton speaks, everybody listens. She never said much, but when she said something, people listened with an open ear. That day, in the commotion, we could hear all 102 floors of the tower pancake upon each other. Bam, 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 and it went like that for what seemed like minutes. She jumped out of her pew and she said the most incredible prayer. Again, we listened. She went, Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. And everybody was very silent listening to her pray that prayer in the midst of chaos. It was almost scriptural. Maranatha, Maranatha, come Lord Jesus, save us at that particular moment. Again, one of those minor spiritual awakenings. Someone in the back, some quack that walked in the door was screaming, anthrax, anthrax. And the verger, and I know you know about vergers at St. Stephen's, he wanted order and decency. He did not want any commotion at all. He was going, shut up, shut up. So we had anthrax, we had Jesus, we had shut up, and we had the building collapsing. And of all the amazing things on the face of the earth, the people laughed. Humor, humility, humanity. Here we were about to die, and we were laughing at just the absurdity of life. People even got under the pews, but there we were, and moments later, the police came in and said, you have got to leave. You've got to get out of this place. There's a naval evacuation going on at the Staten Island ferry. Turned out to be the largest naval evacuation in the history of the United States. There were tugboats and garbage boats and yachts, and ferries, all kinds of people taking people to safety. Policemen said, you've got to get there and get there now. Anyway, let me stop for a moment. Do you want to make a comment about that?
It's stunning to hear you lay out your experience of the day, and I cannot imagine all the range of emotions that were going on inside the church as you were hearing what you were hearing outside. It's also amazing to me as I hear you describe things, that the church did not cave in, or that debris, given how close Trinity Church is to the World Trade Center, and all that was happening outside, how you all survived is just miraculous to me. It is amazing that you got out of that church that day.
The story goes on and it becomes ever more compelling in a way. Indeed, the tower falling, which was 150 yards away, that's a football field and a half, very, very close. It was 4.2 on the Richter scale, as the paper said. People were frightened to death that the great spire of Trinity would crash into the church. But the church was pretty much unscathed, except for a few clear-story windows, a tremendous amount of debris that took weeks and weeks and weeks to clean, and just a terrible smell in the church for months to come. The organist and I, let's go ahead.
I was going to ask, just to finish out sort of the day itself, how did you escape on a tugboat, or how did you get away from what was going on that day?
The organist and I, the organist was Owen Burdick. We ran back into the office building across a pedestrian bridge. Again, the office building had 25 floors. It had a day school in the basement with 150 children, ranging from 6 months old through 4 years old or 5 years old. On that particular day, because it was a voting day, only 90 children were present. The parents had not brought the rest of the children. Had the terrorists come just moments later, they would have killed so many more than just the many that they did kill. Anyway, we, at a given signal, we had little Nextel cell phones with an aerial on it, no coverage from cell phone services, only a walkie-talkie. And at a given signal from the building manager, employees of the church wrapped those children up in their coats, and we began running down the street toward the Staten Island ferry. It was very cloudy outside. It was very dark, debris in the sky. And we turned around at one moment, and the other tower fell, the south tower fell. And I remember watching that and remember feeling like my entire emotional and spiritual life had been drained from me. And I kept repeating a phrase from the prayer book: "Oh God, make us deeply sensible of the shortness and uncertainty of human life." At each moment, I need to hold that in my mind and call my children and tell them I love them, and call my family and say, let's stay connected, because one never knows. We did eventually. All children were okay. All parents were okay. We got to the Staten Island ferry, and 2 city buses appeared. There were no buses going anywhere. And the buses came out of nowhere. They took those children to safety, which was the bus driver's church way across in Brooklyn someplace. And we continued on the Staten Island ferry. I didn't get back until the next day. And then the next chapter of this event begins.
Well, and that's what I wanted to ask next, is if you could describe what the days, weeks, and months following September 11th, 2001 look like for you and for the people of Trinity Church and St. Paul's Chapel, that I know had a tremendous ministry going on by necessity.
In context, Trinity Church, a large operation, kind of a little diocese in itself, built 12 chapels around the city in the 19th century. And over the years, they disenfranchised those chapels and said, you go it alone. But they kept one of them, St. Paul's Chapel, which was built in 1766. It's a replica of St. Martin's in the Field in London. They kept that one 4 blocks north of Trinity Church. corner of Fulton and Broadway. Immediately, as a disaster was occurring, fire and police and parishioners from Trinity Church broke down the doors, opened the place, and allowed rescue workers, fire personnel, and police personnel to come in, to have a seat, to have a bathroom. Parishioners in hours began bringing barbecue pits and began cooking hot dogs and hamburgers for the police and the fire and the rescue people gathered therein. And over the next 9 months, that became one of the greatest respite centers, hospice places in the United States history. We began serving 1,500 meals a day in the days and months to come. We had masseurs, we had psychiatrists, nurses, clergy people from all over. Everybody was trying to help those who served that disaster. And they did that in that little church, which held probably about 250 on a Sunday, but was crowded every other day of the week with those who needed to be served. It was, as many of you probably served there, it was one of the, I would say, one of the damnedest things I've ever seen in my entire life. It was one, I would say, wasn't damned. It was one of the greatest blessings that New York or any others have ever seen, a light in the darkness. And it stayed in operation, in service. What was so interesting about it was the number of parishioners that turned out right at first. I thought, being Episcopalians, we're used to latitude. We reach out to all sorts and conditions. It doesn't matter who they are. And so here they were, right down there immediately before the clergy ever got there, doing the work of the Lord in mission to other people. And pretty soon there were 2 groups of volunteers every day, 2 groups of 12. They began doing that work and they did it expertly. We saw some wonderful things happen. Anybody and everybody could come in and volunteer. One day we had ladies from a prominent church in Connecticut come down, and we had the Hell's Angel from California, and they were paired together. And I thought, well, that's the Episcopal Church at work. They didn't blink an eye. And what we saw was, if you've got your eyes focused on the mission of Jesus Christ, if you really care about the poor, the weak, the sick, and the lonely, the dispossessed, and the hurting, you got your eyes there, you're not going to squabble about anything. You're just going to do the work that's ahead of you. That's exactly what happened at St. Paul's. And I think historically it will be known for that. This inclusivity, this everybody come, as James Joyce once described the church, and that was St. Paul's. It was a mixture of clergy who came in. Some came in black shirts like you and I have today, and they were brand new. And we knew that they were coming in to do something other than the mission of the church. Looked like they had just been bought at the vestment store. So they came in with their Bibles and they were coming in to save people in the pews. And we were able to head them off. We had what we called spiritual bouncers. And one of the code words was, if they say I'm an Episcopal, that's a warning sign for you. We don't say that. We say I'm an Episcopalian. So many came in their brand new black shirts with their black Bibles and said, oh, I'm an Episcopal. I'm here to help you out today. And unfortunately, they were some of the ones that were turned away because their mission was something other than Jesus.
Well, and I think 20 years on, particularly for people who weren't there, it can be hard to remember. But I mean, there was so much chaos for months and months after that, and there were rescue workers around the site. And I remember in subway stations in New York, for months and months, there were pictures of faces of people who had gone missing because family members were still desperately hoping that their loved ones had survived the attack. I remember visiting Ground Zero around Thanksgiving of that year, and the smoke was still billowing up in the air months after 9/11. So it's hard to imagine what it was like to minister in that place day after day with all of that going on around you.
Well, and the smell was incredibly bad for months and months. The stench in the air, the smell of burning steel or whatever that was, the smell of bodies, probably, putrefaction that occurred. It did take until February until the debris was somewhat clear. And yet for the next year, the next 2 years, 3 years, I could look out of my 24th floor office window and see an enormous pit. And for months, it just continued to bring tears to my eyes. And I would go through the event. We had wonderful spiritual helpers in the building, psychologists, psychiatrists, and spiritual directors. And the thing I remember most is they kept saying to us, talk it out before you act it out. So many of you are tempted to go into isolation or to drink heavily or to do God only knows what to change the way you feel. Talk it out before you act it out. That was a great lesson to me because I've begun to do that if and when I feel myself in trouble, especially right now at this time of the fall. My body remembers that event. I was driving down the street the other day, tears falling, and for no ostensible reason, but I think my body remembered what some of this was like. So I called a friend and I said, I just need to talk about what's going on. And they said, do it. It went on for a long time.
Do you have rituals or ways that you personally have tended to mark the anniversary of that event?
Yes, doing exactly what I'm doing with you right now. And thank God I have had several people every year at this time of year who'll call me up and say, could we do a short interview and talk about the events of 9/11? And I always say, yes, indeed, lest we forget. There was an old saint in the 5th century said that forgetfulness is the root of all evil. We need to remember not only the disaster, but the power that was present that day and the redemption that we saw occurring, not only at St. Paul's, but in those minutes at Trinity Church, in those places where parishioners began to come out and cook hamburgers on 9/11 itself, and on 9/12 and on 9/13. So that's one of my big rituals. I always try to go to a Eucharist that day. Episcopalians don't celebrate the Eucharist every single day, but there are a number of other places that do, so I will go and remember those that I cared about that were lost. Trinity Church lost a number of people. I had done a wedding on the Saturday before the disaster, and 7 bridesmaids, 7 groomsmen, bride and groom. Everyone was lost in the disaster except for the bride. And I did that funeral, and that really tears me up to be able to remember that. And the pain of those young people, none of whom had much faith at the time. They howled in desperation throughout the service. So it's a hard time, but it's important to talk about it. So thank you for this.
Well, and I also, you've alluded to this, wonder how the experience of that day has impacted you, and I'm sure continued to impact you since then. How has it impacted your life and ministry and your spirituality?
Yeah, I think I discovered the truth of the phrase connection is the deepest longing of the human soul. Disconnection is the greatest fear, to be alienated, isolated. I know that vulnerability is the key to that connection. And for me to be able to talk this out, or whatever other soft places in my heart need to be talked out, I need to do that in order to stay connected with others. I've been a very faithful member of a 12-step recovery program for the last 34 years. And that's also been a great gift in this business of connection. I'm one that needs to stay connected, especially in the work that I do in the church, and in going to disasters like I do at times. So that's one of the great things in my life. The other is the friends that I've made over the years and staying so closely connected with them. And you're one of those. I had the occasion to preach at your installation, which was one of the greatest evenings that I can recall. And I just feel a close kinship with you wherever we are, and we'll stay together till death do us part, and then some, which is the glory of this thing. The other thing that I hold on so deeply is in that experience at St. Paul's Chapel, anybody and everybody came. Not only Christians of all denominations, but we had Muslims, Jews, Sikhs, Hindus from all over New York and beyond that came and not only worshiped in that chapel, but helped so much do God's mission in that place. There were cards and letters from all over the world on the walls and in the pews addressed to those who work there, to those who serve there, to those who were served, the servees, the ones who were served. And they kept coming in from everybody all across the world. On the first anniversary, we had an ecumenical event, and it was just glorious. The Whitechapel Foundry in London, who made the Liberty Bell, created a wonderful bell for St. Paul's and for the city of New York. It's called the Freedom Bell. And it was given to us. I got a call one day, and this man said, "I'm the mayor of London. I'd like to talk to you about a gift we want to give." And I thought it was a joke. I said, "Oh yeah, surely you're the mayor of London." Well, it turned out it was. And I got to go to London and negotiate the building of this bell. And it's settling in St. Paul's churchyard in the front of St. Paul's Chapel in New York City. On that day, every religion possible and then some gathered together in that churchyard with their representatives and prayed together. What said to me, this is the thing we need to be doing every year at this time. But not only every year, we've got to do it right now. I live in Little Rock, Arkansas. We have such a good record of ecumenical relations in this city, in the broader sense. We've just had our great yearly interfaith service last week. Unfortunately, it had to be online because of pandemic precautions. But it's usually an occasion where 400 or 500 people gather together. They eat together. If we could only just eat together, wonderful things can happen. That is fellowship in the best sense of the word. That is companionship, eating bread together. And it just produces such dividends, or at least it has in our community. There's an interfaith center in Little Rock, and it's well used, and it's constantly doing work for children in the area, for adults in the area, educational classes, worship events, bringing us all together and making opportunities for small groups to get together and again to eat together. So those were some of the things that I learned about that. It so grieved us when we learned some years ago that there was hostility around the country for building a Muslim chapel near St. Paul's. It was to be right across the street. We were rejoicing in that. But some of the people around us were not rejoicing. We were horrified because of the number of Muslims who died in the disaster and the numbers of one who came to help us. And for them to be said, no, you can't build a memorial here was just beyond belief. So we really grieve that, but that's the nature of things right now. And we must keep working on that score, lest we die as a people.
Well, and that leads me to sort of my final questions here. it's amazing to me that it has been 20 years. I mean, it has marked my adult life. I really consider myself a part of the 9/11 generation. I was the last college class to graduate pre 9/11. I graduated Boston University in the spring of that year. And so I wonder if your perspective has changed at all given the distance of time on that event, or perhaps has it been informed in some way by all that has happened since 9/11? And of course, our recent withdrawal from Afghanistan is a tragic end to a war that was launched just after 9/11. I wonder what your thoughts are about that.
So much of 9/11 is still present with me. It was a time when things changed and changed dramatically. It was a time when we heard the words, "Let's go smoke them out," instead of what we heard in that day in the chapel, which were the Beatitudes. Sometimes read the Beatitudes. An editor from the paper in New York wrote a little column after 9/11, and it said the first spiritual strike against terrorism was a priest at Trinity Church, New York, reading the Beatitudes at the moment when the sky fell upon us. And he said that was the first strike against terrorism. It was a spiritual strike, and it was very much different from the strikes which occurred thereafter. Using violence to curb violence has never worked in history, and we seem to be doomed to try that over and over and over again. And as this church preaches, it's the transformative power of love. And that sounds like such a naive and silly thing to say sometimes. But in my 75 years, I really believe that. And I do think that is the only way. Jesus said, "I am the way." He's not saying you have to become an Episcopalian. He's saying, I command you to love one another as I've loved you.
Yeah, as a native New Yorker with Middle Eastern roots, with family members in Egypt, and of course there were Egyptian nationals who were part of those terrorist cells that attacked our country on 9/11. I've been very much on a lifelong journey to reconcile, I think, the gap within myself between my American side and my Middle Eastern side. As a young person, I remember in the days and weeks after 9/11 seeing Arab people, Muslim people having to put American flags in their backpacks or on their person, lest they be attacked because of the deep need to strike out that was certainly pervasive in the country immediately after 9/11. And there still is such a gap between our part of the world and the Middle East. And in many respects, I feel like our country needs to continue to be on a journey, as I have been on a journey in my own person, in order to try to move towards reconciliation and hopefully, ultimately, peace.
Yeah.
I wonder how you've seen the church try to engage in that over the years, and what you think the church's role is at this time and in the future.
It's precisely what you're saying. It's the role of reconciliation. First of all, to be reconciled within oneself, and then to be reconciled with my neighbor, and then to be reconciled with the greater picture. There's so much we cannot do, but there are things we can do on a small scale. This interview is one of them. A preaching of a sermon is one of them. A scriptural study group, not only with just those doing Bible study, but why don't you bring in the Quran sometimes, or why don't you bring in the Bhagavad Gita, and let's study some of those together. All religions focus on the love of God in one way or another. Why don't we isolate those texts and begin to share them? Love one another. Love is patient, love is kind, love is not boastful or rude, love doesn't strut, says one translation. And we are masters at strutting not only in this country, but in the Western, in our, what is it, Eurocentric countries. We strut. We're the biggest, we're the best, and we'll get our way. We're paying a price for that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, there's so much further reflection and prayerful reflection that needs to happen. But I'm so grateful, Stuart, that you've taken the time to share your reflections about that day and to be present with me and with those listening in. For those who are listening in, we will put out information on our e-newsletter about events happening at Trinity Church Wall Street that folks can log on and participate in from afar. And I do hope that you hold in your hearts all those who died on that day and all the first responders who have died since then because of the toxic fumes on the site, as well as all the people in the Middle East and around the world who have also died on the so-called war on terror. There have been many, many lives lost, and we need to hold them in prayer and prayerfully work for reconciliation and peace moving forward.
Yes.
But there will be much more to come on all of that, to be sure. But thank you so much for listening in, and you take care. And when you're outside, friends, stay safe and wear your mask. So long.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.